There is a particular quality to the light in a room where someone is playing a video game late at night. The rest of the house is dark. The television or the monitor casts a soft, shifting glow, blues and greens and warm yellows depending on what is happening on screen. The person sitting in front of it is very still, except perhaps for their hands, which move in small, practiced ways. Their face is quiet. Their breathing is slow. There is something almost meditative about it. Something that goes very deep in the human experience. The desire to enter a world that is not quite this one, to move through it, to understand its rules, to see what happens when you do one thing and then another. People have always played. That is one of the oldest things we know about ourselves. Before there were screens, before there were circuits or code or any of the technology that we think of when we hear the word video game, there were boards and pieces and dice and cards. There were children throwing stones at targets in the dust. There were adults playing chess in the afternoon light of a cafe window, the pieces heavy in the hand, worn smooth from years of use. Play is not something human beings invented in the 20th century. It is something that has always been there, waiting for new forms to inhabit. The video game is simply the newest of those forms, and it arrived, as new things often do, quietly and almost accidentally, in the middle of doing something else entirely. To understand where video games came from, you have to go back to a time before anyone was thinking about games at all. The machines that would eventually become computers were built in the 1940s for serious and urgent purposes. The Second World War had created a need for calculating, for working out trajectories, for breaking codes, for solving mathematical problems too large and too fast for any human being to manage alone. Enormous machines were built in university basements and government laboratories, machines that filled entire rooms, that generated considerable heat, that hummed and clicked with a particular sound that people who worked near them would always remember. These machines were made of vacuum tubes, small glass cylinders, each one about the size of a light bulb that glowed faintly when in operation. A single computer might contain 10,000 of them or more. The light they produced was amber and warm, and the room they occupied would have that warmth in it. Not quite the warmth of a fireplace, but a technological warmth. The warmth of a thing that was working very hard. The people who operated these machines were mathematicians and engineers mostly. They thought of them as tools. Very powerful tools, yes. Very expensive tools. But tools, not playthings. The idea that someone might one day use one of these enormous, serious vacuum tube machines to play a game would have struck most of them as slightly absurd. And yet, in 1952, a researcher named Alexander Douglas at the University of Cambridge completed his doctoral thesis on human-computer interaction. As part of his work, he built something, almost as an afterthought, almost as a demonstration, that he called OXO. It was a version of noughts and crosses, what Americans call tic-tac-toe, displayed on a cathode ray tube display. A player could input their moves using a rotary telephone dial, and the computer would respond. OXO is often cited as one of the earliest video games. It was not a game that anyone played for fun, really. It was a technical demonstration. The tube that displayed it was small and green-tinted, and the noughts and crosses appeared on it as simple lit points on a grid. But something was there, even in that simple form. The idea that a machine could accept your input and respond, that you could be in some kind of dialogue with it, was new and strange and quietly remarkable. A few years later, in 1958, a physicist named William Higginbotham was working at a national laboratory in New York. He was preparing a public exhibition and wanted to show visitors something that would capture their interest. He designed a simple game. 2 lines representing tennis players, a blip representing a ball, bouncing back and forth on an oscilloscope screen. He called it Tennis for Two. It was set up in the exhibition hall and visitors queued to use it. They stood in front of the machine and turned their little aluminum controllers, watching the blip of light arc across the screen and back. Some of them laughed. Most of them wanted to play again. Higginbotham was not particularly proud of it. He considered it a minor diversion, something he had knocked together in a few weeks. He never patented it, never pursued it further, and spent the rest of his career working on much weightier matters: arms control, nuclear policy. But the visitors who stood in that hall and watched a light move in response to their hands had experienced something they could not quite name, something that pulled them back for another turn. That pull. That is the thing. It was already there, even in those very first experiments, even on those green-tinted screens in university basements and exhibition halls. The particular feeling of agency, of being the one who makes the thing move, of being responded to by something on the other side of the glass, was there from the very beginning. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the machines grew slightly smaller and slightly more accessible, and the people who worked with them found other games to build. A group of students and researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology spent a considerable amount of time in the early 1960s building a game called Space War. It ran on a machine called a PDP-1, a computer that was, by the standards of the time, almost compact. It filled a large cabinet rather than an entire room. The display was a round screen about the size of a dinner plate, and on it 2 small spaceships could be moved by players using control boxes, firing torpedoes at each other while a tiny, accurate simulation of a star's gravity pulled at both of them. The people who built Space War worked on it in the evenings and on weekends, in the way that people work on things they love. They added features gradually, the gravity well, the hyperspace escape button that would make your ship vanish and reappear somewhere random, the star-filled background painstakingly calculated to match the actual night sky, as seen from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Space War spread from laboratory to laboratory as the machines it ran on spread. Researchers would copy it, carry it with them, install it on new machines at new institutions. By the late 1960s, it existed on dozens of machines at universities and research centres across the United States. Late at night, when the day's official work was done, people would sit down at these enormous, expensive computers and play. This is how games began. Not in a boardroom, not as a commercial product, but in the small hours of the morning, in rooms full of equipment that was nominally there for something else, made by people who were supposed to be doing something more serious, and who could not quite help themselves. The first time video games met commerce was not especially graceful, but it was significant. In 1971, a young engineer named Nolan Bushnell saw Spaceware running on a machine at the University of Utah, and had a thought that would change a great deal. The thought was essentially, what if this were in a box, and you could put the box in a bar and people would put coins in it? The first coin-operated arcade game he developed was called Computer Space. It was a version of Space War, simplified and fitted into a fiberglass cabinet. A cabinet that was curved and futuristic looking, in the style that the early 1970s had for imagining the future. It was installed in bars and diners and bus stations. People walked up to it, read the instructions, felt confused, and mostly walked away. Computer Space was not a success. The controls were too complicated, the rules too opaque. People standing in a bar with a drink in their hand did not have the patience for it. But Bushnell had learned something from its failure. He went on to found a company called Atari, and in 1972, he asked one of his engineers to make the simplest game imaginable. Something anyone could understand in seconds. Something with a ball and 2 paddles and a score. The engineer's name was Alan Alcorn. He had never designed a game before. He built what Bushnell had described, a table tennis game reduced to its barest essentials. 2 white rectangles and a small white square on a black screen, and they called it Pong. The first Pong cabinet was installed in a bar in Sunnyvale, California, in the autumn of 1972. It was bolted to the bar's wall. Within a few days, the bar called Atari to report that the machine had stopped working. When an engineer came to look at it, he found that it had not stopped working so much as it had been played so much that its coin collector had jammed. There were too many quarters in it. The arcades that grew up around these early games were particular places with a particular atmosphere, and if you have never been to one from that era, it is worth trying to imagine it. They were usually in strip malls or shopping centres, low-ceilinged rooms with carpet that was dark-coloured and slightly sticky, lit primarily by the glow of the cabinet screens themselves. The sound was extraordinary. Layers of different electronic sounds from different machines, all happening at once, a kind of dense and cheerful cacophony. The sound of Pac-Man eating pellets, the sound of Space Invaders descending in their rhythmic rows, the sound of a racing game's engine overlapping with the sound of a pinball machine's bells. The cabinet stood in rows, each one a different shape and size. Some were tall and upright with screens set at eye level. Some were low and horizontal, with the screen set into the cabinet top like a table, so players bent over them. Some were wedge-shaped. Some had special controllers, steering wheels, joysticks that moved in ways the standard ones did not. Plastic guns attached by curling cords. Children stood in front of them with their quarters held in their fists. They watched the person currently playing with the intense attention, learning the patterns, planning what they would do when it was their turn. When the current player lost their last life, there was a brief moment of silence from the machine, and then the attract mode would begin. A looping demonstration, the game playing itself, showing what it could do, inviting anyone passing by to come and have a look. The feeling of inserting a quarter and pressing the start button was a specific feeling, a ritual feeling. The screen would shift from the attract mode to the beginning of the game, and for a moment everything in the room would recede slightly, and there would be just you and the machine and whatever was about to happen on the screen in front of you. The arcade was also a social place, in a way that is easy to underestimate. People gathered around the machines that someone was doing well on. If someone was on a record-breaking run, if someone was 45 minutes into a Pac-Man game, navigating levels that most players never saw, a small crowd would form. They stood at a respectful distance, not wanting to disturb the concentration, but close enough to watch and murmur to each other. There was a quality to this that was not so different from watching a street performer, or a musician, or any person doing something difficult very well in a public space. The high scores were recorded on the machine itself, in a list of 3-letter initials. If you beat the highest score on a machine, you could enter your initials and they would stay there, displayed on that screen, in that arcade, for as long as no one beat you. This was a small and local kind of fame, visible only to the people who passed through that particular building in that particular town. But it was real fame for those who cared about it, which many did. Space Invaders arrived from Japan in 1978 and changed something about the atmosphere of gaming. It had a particular quality, the way the aliens descended in their neat rows, the way the tempo of their movement sped up as you picked them off, the way that acceleration created a feeling of mounting pressure that was not quite panic, but was something adjacent to it. Players reported dreaming about it. In Japan, it was said to have caused a shortage of 100 yen coins, and then Pac-Man in 1980, a different kind of pressure, a more maze-like, more personal kind of attention. Pac-Man had a personality. The ghosts had personalities. They had names and behaviours. Blinky chased you directly. Inky was unpredictable. Clyde wandered. Pinky tried to get ahead of you. Players learned these behaviours and planned around them, developing strategies that felt almost like conversations. There was a woman in New York in the early 1980s named Sue-Ann Bally, who became one of the world's top Pac-Man players. There were others like her, people who had memorized the patterns so thoroughly that they could play for hours on a single quarter, the ghosts moving around them in a kind of choreography they had worked out over months of practice. They were not doing anything that looked like work, they were playing. But the depth of attention they brought to it, the precision of it, was not unlike any other kind of mastery. The machines were coming home. Throughout the late 1970s, various companies had been working on the idea of bringing games into the living room. Not the full arcade experience. The technology was not there for that yet, but something. A box that connected to the television. A cartridge you could buy at the shop and slide into the box. The Atari 2600 arrived in 1977, and within a few years it was in millions of living rooms. It was a simple thing, a black box with fake wood panelling on the front, 2 joystick ports, a row of switches along the top. The cartridges were wide and flat, about the size of a small book, with a label on the front that usually showed artwork depicting something rather more spectacular than what the game itself could actually produce. The games on the 2600 were simple by any later standard. The graphics were blocky, the colours limited, but people sat on their living room floors in front of the television and played them for hours. They played Adventure, a game that contained what is often considered the first Easter egg in video game history, a hidden room with the developer's name tucked inside it. They played Pitfall and Asteroids and Demon Attack. They played them after school and on weekend mornings and late at night when they should have been sleeping. The living room was changed by this. The television, which had previously been a passive thing, something you watched while it showed you what it chose to show you, became interactive. You could have some control over what appeared on it. You could make things happen. This was new and strange, and for children especially, intoxicating. But then, in 1983, something happened that the industry had not expected. The market for home video games collapsed. Not gradually, quickly. The shops were flooded with games of very poor quality, games rushed to market by companies trying to capitalize on the craze without putting in the time or care to make something good. There was a game based on the film E.T. that is still discussed today as an example of spectacular failure. Made in 5 weeks, barely playable, shipped in enormous quantities that far exceeded what anyone could reasonably sell. Millions of unsold cartridges ended up buried in a landfill in New Mexico, where they remained for decades until a team of archaeologists and filmmakers dug them up again. Consumers lost confidence. Shops stopped stocking games. The great arcade chains began to thin out. It looked, for a moment in 1983 and 1984, as though video games had been a fad, something that had burned brightly for a few years and was now going out. And then, from Japan, quietly and without much fanfare, a company called Nintendo arrived. Nintendo was not a young company. It had been founded in Kyoto in 1889, more than 100 years before any of this, making playing cards. It had sold toys and novelties through the mid-20th century before finding its way into video games in the late 1970s. By the early 1980s, it had produced several successful arcade games, Donkey Kong among them, a game about a carpenter named Jumpman who would later be renamed Mario, climbing platforms and jumping over barrels thrown by a gorilla. The Nintendo Entertainment System, the Famicom as it was known in Japan, launched in the United States in 1985 at a moment when American retailers were deeply skeptical of video games. Nintendo packaged it differently. They called it an entertainment system rather than a game console. They included a small robot toy. They presented it as something different from what had come before, and with it came a game called Super Mario Bros. It is difficult now to fully convey what Super Mario Bros. Felt like in 1985, because so much of what games became was built on what it established. The way the world scrolled smoothly from left to right. The way the little plumber moved. The weight of him. The way he skidded when you changed direction. The way his jump had a particular arc that you learned to control with small adjustments of pressure on the button. The coins in their rows, the question mark blocks, the underground levels with their different music, the castles at the end of each world. There was a man in California named Miyamoto Shigeru who had designed most of it. He had grown up in the countryside of Kyoto, and he spoke later about how the game was influenced by his memories of childhood, of exploring fields and forests, of finding caves and wondering what was inside them. The game had that quality to it, the feeling of a world that extended outward in directions you had not yet explored, that rewarded curiosity, that had secrets in it. Children played it, and then told each other about the secrets, passed information by word of mouth at school, in the playground, on the bus home. There was no internet to look these things up on. If you wanted to know where the warp zones were, someone had to tell you, or you had to find them yourself. There was a particular thrill to discovering something in a game that you had not been told about, that no one had told you about. Coming across a pipe that led underground to a room full of coins, hitting a block that seemed empty, and finding a vine that grew upward into a secret cloud level above the regular sky. These moments of discovery had a quality of genuine surprise that is harder to manufacture now, when the internet makes the secrets of any game available within hours of release. The cartridge itself was a kind of artifact. You kept it in a cardboard box. You kept the box on a shelf or in a drawer or in a pile with other cartridges, the labels facing outward. The label art showed something aspirational, something more detailed and dramatic than what the game could actually produce on screen. This was understood and accepted. The label was a promise, an indication of what the game was trying to be. The game itself was what you got, and usually that was enough. The television was involved but transformed. The television was now something you could speak to in a way, something that would change in response to what you did. This was new in the home in a way it had not been before. Children sat close to it. closer than their parents thought was probably good for their eyes. The light from it was close and warm. The sounds it made were small and specific and, over time, inseparable from the feelings they accompanied. The mid-1980s and into the 1990s were years of rapid change, and the best way to move through them gently is to let them drift past in the way a river landscape drifts past from a slow-moving boat. Sega arrived as a competitor to Nintendo. The rivalry between the two companies became something that children took personally, in the way children take things personally when they are invested in them. You were a Nintendo household or a Sega household mostly. The schoolyard arguments about which was better had a fervour to them that was, in retrospect, entirely disproportionate to what was actually at stake. Sega's mascot was Sonic the Hedgehog, blue, fast, impatient, with an attitude that was presented as cool in a way that Mario's gentle plumber energy was not. Sonic tapped his foot while he waited for you to do something. He was designed to appeal to teenagers who might have felt they had outgrown Mario. The two characters represented two very different ideas about what games could be and who they were for. The machines themselves were becoming more powerful with each generation. The 16-bit era, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, could do things the earlier machines could not. The colours were richer. The music was more complex. The sound chip of the Super Nintendo in particular had a warmth to it that musicians and composers who worked with it still speak of with affection, a specific quality to the sound, something between digital and organic that was entirely its own. The composers who wrote music for these machines were working within strict constraints, limited channels, limited instruments, limited memory, and within those constraints they produced music that has stayed with people for 30 years and more. Koji Kondo, who wrote the music for Super Mario Bros. And for The Legend of Zelda, and for countless other Nintendo games, is one of the most widely heard composers of the late 20th century, though his name is not always known by the people who could hum his melodies from memory. The Zelda theme, which opens each new game in the series with a brief fanfare, is one of those pieces of music that functions as a kind of door. When you hear it, something opens slightly inside you, a sense of expectation, of a particular kind of world about to become available. This is what sustained, emotionally resonant music can do when it is tied to something experienced rather than only heard. Games were being made by larger teams now, in rooms in Tokyo and Osaka and elsewhere, by people who had started to think of themselves as game developers rather than simply programmers. They were importing ideas from film, from literature, from architecture. The worlds they were building were getting larger and more detailed. The stories they were telling were getting more complicated. The physical experience of the cartridges was its own small pleasure. They were solid objects, heavier than they looked. The contacts on the bottom, the row of small gold rectangles that connected the cartridge to the machine, could tarnish, and a common ritual was to blow into the cartridge before inserting it, a habit that was later shown by electrical engineers to be probably more harmful than helpful, but which nevertheless felt necessary and right. The click of the cartridge sliding into the machine, the particular resistance of it, and then the release as it seated itself properly. Meanwhile, something entirely different was happening on the personal computer. The PC, the personal computer, which had been spreading through offices and then homes throughout the 1980s, was a different kind of gaming machine. It sat on a desk. It had a keyboard. It attracted a different kind of game. Text adventures had been around since the 1970s, games made entirely of words, in which you typed commands and the game responded with descriptions of what happened. You were in a maze of twisty little passages all alike. You are holding a small lamp. Exits are to the north and east. You typed "Go North" and pressed return and waited to see what the game told you. These games required patience and a willingness to be lost. They required reading and imagination. They filled the screen with prose rather than pictures. They were quiet in a way that arcade games were not. Colossal Cave Adventure, often considered the first of them, was written in the 1970s by a programmer named Will Crowther, who had been a cave explorer, and who had mapped a real cave system in Kentucky in considerable detail. He used that map as the basis for the game, so the virtual cave that players explored was not entirely invented. It was, in important ways, a translation of a real place, a dark and wet and extraordinary real place underground, into a form that could be travelled through with words. The caves in the game had their own logic, their own landmarks, their own navigational demands. There was a room described as having a rough stone floor, and another described as a narrow corridor with a glimmer of light at the far end. Players made maps of these spaces on graph paper, filling in squares as they explored, noting which exits led where, which paths looped back on themselves. The mapping was part of the pleasure. The game required you to build a mental model of a space that did not exist, and then to move through it as though it did. The most famous of them was Zork, and then a whole lineage of adventure games that followed, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, made in collaboration with Douglas Adams, who brought to it his particular form of gentle absurdity. King's Quest, which added pictures to the words. Myst, which arrived in 1993 and dispensed with words almost entirely, replacing them with a world rendered in still images of extraordinary detail and atmospheric stillness. An island, a library, mechanisms that needed to be understood before they could be operated, puzzles that existed in the quiet spaces between things. Myst was played in silence mostly. It suited a certain kind of attention, slow, contemplative, unhurried. You clicked through it carefully, noting things, returning to things, gradually building up a sense of a place and its history. It sold more copies than any computer game had sold before it, which surprised many people in the industry who had assumed that this kind of patient, cerebral experience was a minority taste. Perhaps it was not such a minority taste after all. Role-playing games were growing up in parallel, and they deserved their own slow wander. The tradition they came from was a tabletop one, Dungeons and Dragons, created in the 1970s, in which a group of people sat around a table with pencils and graph paper and dice, and collectively imagined a world, one person describing it and the others moving through it. The dice introduced chance, the rules introduced structure, the imagination of the players introduced everything else. When role-playing games moved onto computers, they kept some of this and lost some of it. They lost the social element of sitting around a table with friends, but they gained persistence, a world that was always there when you came back to it, that held your progress, that remembered what you had done. The early computer RPGs, Wizardry, Ultima, Bard's Tale, were demanding things. They asked you to draw your own maps on graph paper as you explored, because the games themselves provided no map. They killed your characters easily and without ceremony. They expected patience and careful thought and a willingness to start again. Later came Final Fantasy, which arrived from Japan and brought with it a different aesthetic, more cinematic, more story-focused, with characters who had names and faces and feelings. The Final Fantasy series expanded through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, each installment trying something slightly different. And when Final Fantasy VII arrived in 1997, it did something that had not quite happened before. It told a story that people cried at. There was a character named Aerith, gentle, flower-selling, warm-voiced in memory, and there was a moment about halfway through the game that came without warning. People who played it remember exactly where they were. They remember the music that played. They remember sitting very still for a moment afterward, not quite sure what to do with the feeling. It is a strange thing to cry at a game, to feel grief for a person made of polygons, a few hundred triangles arranged into something that resembled a young woman. But the feeling was real. Games had reached somewhere they had not quite reached before. The shift to 3 dimensions was the largest single change in the history of the medium, and it happened quickly. The Sony PlayStation arrived in 1994, and the Nintendo 64 in 1996, and both of them could render 3-dimensional worlds in a way that the previous generation could not. Not perfectly. The polygons were chunky, the textures often muddy, the distance foggy because drawing very far into a 3-dimensional space was computationally expensive. But the sense of being inside a space rather than moving across a flat surface was entirely new. Super Mario 64, which launched with the Nintendo 64, was designed by Miyamoto Shigeru's team as a deliberate answer to the question of how Mario would work in 3 dimensions. They gave the player the ability to move the camera, to look around, to adjust the angle from which they saw the world. This sounds like a small thing, but it was a revolution. You were not just playing a character, you were in some sense inhabiting a space. The first thing the game asked you to do was nothing. It placed you in a small courtyard outside a castle, with a garden and a moat and a mountain in the distance, and let you run around. There was nothing to collect, nothing to achieve, just the space and your ability to move through it. Players report spending long minutes simply running around that courtyard, jumping, turning, testing what their body could do in this new world, before going inside to begin the game proper. Something about that courtyard stays with people. Tomb Raider, released in 1996, was another three-dimensional world. Darker, more atmospheric, built from ancient ruins and underwater caverns and mountain passes. Its protagonist, Lara Croft, moved through these spaces with a physicality that made the architecture feel real. You could hear her footsteps change on different surfaces. She grunted when she grabbed a ledge. She breathed audibly in places that were frightening. The sound design of games was becoming its own art form in these years. The specific sound of a PlayStation loading, the mechanical whir and click as the disc spun up, was itself a kind of ritual, the sound of a world preparing to open. The particular music of specific games became memory attached in ways that other music rarely is. Attached not just to a time or a feeling, but to a place, to a fictional geography that had somehow become real to the person who had moved through it. The late 1990s brought a game that many people have carried with them ever since: The Legend of Zelda. Ocarina of Time arrived in November 1998 for the Nintendo 64. It was a game about a boy named Link who travelled through time and across a landscape of plains and mountains and forests and deserts, learning music that would change the world around him, gathering pieces of a power that would let him face something dark. The music was central to it. Link carried an ocarina, a small egg-shaped clay instrument, and learned to play songs on it throughout the game. Each song did something different. One called the rain, one moved the sun through the sky, one summoned a horse named Epona, one opened doors that had been closed. You played the songs by pressing buttons in the right sequence, and you could hear the melody come out of the cartridge speakers in a small and specific way. Players memorized those songs. Decades later, they still remember them. The notes of Saria's song, which played in the Lost Woods. The opening melody of the Song of Storms, which summoned wind and rain. These sequences of button presses had become, through repetition and emotion and context, a kind of personal music. Something that belonged to you as much as it belonged to the game. There was a place in the game called Kokiri Forest, where Link had grown up. Small wooden houses built into the trees, soft light filtering through the canopy, a warm and slightly enclosed feeling. Players returned to it often, even when they had no in-game reason to do so. They walked around it, listening to the music, talking to the small characters who lived there. Something about it felt like home, in a way that was strange to articulate but unmistakable to feel. This is what the best world building in games could do, in these years and in the years since. Not just create a place that was visually interesting, but create a place that you felt you understood, whose rhythms and atmosphere and daily life you had absorbed through hours of moving through it, so that returning to it had the quality of return, of coming back to something that had been waiting for you. The late 1990s also brought GoldenEye 007, a game based on a James Bond film which arrived on the Nintendo 64 in 1997, and introduced millions of players to the specific joy of 4 people sharing a single television, each controlling a small character on a split screen, moving through the same space and trying to eliminate each other. Living rooms were reconfigured for this. Friends came over specifically for this. The arguments it generated about whether certain weapons or tactics were fair became the kind of arguments that people quote back at each other years later, still not entirely resolved. Into the early 2000s, and the world was getting noisier, and games were getting louder with it. The PlayStation 2 arrived in 2000 and became the best-selling game console in history, a record it holds to this day. The Xbox followed in 2001, and it brought with it Halo, a first-person shooting game set on a ring-shaped artificial world in space, that many people point to as the game that made online multiplayer feel mainstream. There were voice chat and competitive modes, and the particular energy of playing against other human beings rather than the patterns built by a programmer. The GameCube sat quietly in the corner of the console wars of that era, doing its own gentle thing, producing games that were quieter and stranger and more personal. Animal Crossing, in which you moved to a small village of anthropomorphic animals and did very little of consequence, caught fish, grew flowers, visited neighbours, paid off a mortgage to a raccoon in manageable instalments. There was no way to fail. There was no final boss, no end state, no catastrophe to avert. You simply lived there for as long as you wanted to among the animals who greeted you by name. It was a game about time, in a quiet way. It ran on a real clock. If you played it in the morning, it was morning in the village. If you played at midnight, the village was dark and most of the animals were in their homes, and the night insects made their sounds in the grass. Certain things only happened at certain times of year. You could miss things. The village continued whether you were there or not. People found this deeply comforting, for reasons that were hard to articulate. Something about the constancy of it. Something about a place that kept going, that was patient, that was always there. The animals in the village had personalities and moods and things they wanted to talk about. They would mention, if you had not visited in a while, that they had missed you. They would remember things you had talked about before. They would give you gifts and ask for favours and occasionally say something unexpectedly philosophical for an anthropomorphic bear or rabbit or duck. One of the neighbours in Animal Crossing was a cranky old bird named Anchovy, who collected catchphrases and would greet you with a different one each time, depending on his mood. Another was a lazy cat named Bob, who mostly wanted to talk about food and sleep. The personalities were broad and simple, in the way that characters in a fairy tale are broad and simple, but they were consistent. Bob was always Bob. Anchovy was always Anchovy. And there is a comfort in that kind of consistency, in knowing exactly who you are going to find when you open the door. When a new version of Animal Crossing called New Horizons was released in March 2020, at the beginning of a global pandemic that had forced a large portion of the world's population indoors, something notable happened. The game sold in extraordinary numbers. Players who had never played Animal Crossing before found themselves spending their evenings on their fictional islands, growing trees and decorating interiors and visiting friends' islands via the internet. The fictional outdoor life, the fishing at a river's edge, the strolling along a beach at sunset, the digging for fossils in a meadow, stood in for the real outdoor life that had become for a while unavailable. It was a small and particular comfort, and people received it gratefully. There was a game called EverQuest, released in 1999, and then another called World of Warcraft, released in 2004, and they introduced something that changed what games could be in a fundamental way. They were online. Not online in the sense of playing against someone else for an hour and then going home. Online in the sense of persistent, worlds that existed continuously on servers that were inhabited by thousands of people simultaneously, that changed and grew while you were away and were exactly as you left them when you came back. World of Warcraft, at its peak, had 12 million subscribers, 12 million people paying a monthly fee to live, part-time, in a fantasy world of dwarves and elves and dragons, in a landscape that stretched across continents and oceans, with a day cycle and a weather system and seasons and events. Guilds formed, communities of players who knew each other only online, who met at set times to venture into dangerous parts of the world together, who developed friendships and rivalries and in-jokes and shared histories. The social architecture of these games was as complex as any physical architecture. There were hierarchies and economies and cultures. There was a guild called Serenity Now, and there was a guild called Nihilum, and people who played World of Warcraft in those years remember these names the way people remember the names of sports teams, with a kind of fond, distant loyalty. People fell in love in World of Warcraft. People got married, in the sense of having a wedding ceremony inside the game, with their guilds standing around them. People attended each other's funerals, in the sense of gathering their characters together in a quiet part of the virtual world, to stand in silence for someone who had died in the real one. These things sound strange from the outside. They do not sound strange from the inside. The handheld had been growing alongside all of this, in its own small and portable way. The Game Boy had arrived in 1989, small and grey and battery-powered, with a screen that was easy to look at in direct sunlight, and impossible to look at in the dark. It played Tetris, which came bundled with it, a game about falling blocks that needed to be arranged into horizontal lines. Tetris was designed in the Soviet Union in 1984 by a programmer named Alexei Pajitnov, working on a computer that could only display text characters. He used the text characters to make his falling shapes. The Game Boy and Tetris together sold in enormous quantities. People played Tetris on trains and in waiting rooms, and in the back seats of cars on long journeys. The game was hypnotic in a way that is easy to understand if you have played it. It is entirely about pattern and rhythm, about fitting things together, and that fitting together produced a feeling of mild and continuous satisfaction that was very easy to keep chasing. Decades later, researchers studying the psychology of games found that Tetris could reduce the intrusiveness of traumatic memories, that playing it in the hours after a distressing event could interrupt the consolidation of those memories in the brain. The researchers were careful and cautious in their findings, as researchers are, but it was interesting. The game that people had been playing on their commutes for 20 years, the game that seemed to do almost nothing, was doing something to the brain after all. The Nintendo DS arrived in 2004 with 2 screens, one of them a touch screen, and the ability to close it like a clamshell and put it in a pocket. It was a friendly feeling device, slightly chunky, with a satisfying click when you closed it. It played games that were specific to its format, Brain Age, which asked players to do mental arithmetic and read aloud and trace things with the stylus. Nintendogs, in which you raised a puppy, you could speak to it through the microphone, and it would tilt its head and look at you. These were not games in the traditional sense of challenge and obstacle and victory. They were something softer, something more in the space of interaction and companionship. They found audiences that traditional games had not reached. Older adults played Brain Age in large numbers. Children played Nintendogs with a tenderness that surprised observers. In 2006, Nintendo did something that genuinely changed the physical experience of play. The Wii came with a controller that you held in your hand and moved through the air, and the motion of your hand was translated into movement on the screen. You could bowl by swinging the controller as you would swing a bowling ball. You could play tennis by swinging it as you would swing a racket. You could steer a car by tilting it. Living rooms became active in a way they had not previously been. People stood up from their sofas, they swung their arms, they knocked things off shelves. There were news stories about television screens broken by controllers that had slipped from sweaty hands. Nintendo introduced a wrist strap, which helped. The Wii reached people who had never played video games before. Grandparents played it at Christmas. Retirement homes bought it. People in hospital rehabilitation used it for physiotherapy. The barrier that had always existed between people who played games and people who did not play games was briefly and genuinely reduced. And the games that came with it, Wii Sports in particular, with its bright colours and its simple instructions and its cheerful little avatars that you could customise to look approximately like yourself, had a warmth to them that the more serious end of the medium sometimes lacked. There was something lovely about watching your grandmother bowl a strike and watching her understand that she had bowled a strike, and watching her face as she decided to bowl again. The high-definition era arrived with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 in 2005 and 2006, and with it came something that changed the visual experience of games in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who sat down with them. The grass moved in individual blades, the light changed as clouds passed overhead, faces had creases and shadows, and the specific imperfections of real faces. Water behaved like water, reflecting the sky above it, refracting the light below, moving in response to objects passing through it. The gap between the world on the screen and the world outside the window narrowed in a way that had not happened at any previous moment. Games were being made now by teams of hundreds of people. Studio complexes housed hundreds of artists and programmers and writers and sound designers, all working on single titles for periods of 3 or 4 or 5 years. The credits at the end of a large game were longer than the credits of a film. They scrolled past on screen for 10 or 15 minutes, hundreds of names, organised by department, followed by acknowledgements and dedications and the names of the people the developers had married or who had been born while the game was in production. Red Dead Redemption, released in 2010, was set in the American West at the turn of the 20th century, at the moment when the frontier was closing and the old ways of doing things were becoming obsolete. You rode a horse across a vast landscape, across scrubland and marshes and mountains and desert, and the horse moved in a way that felt genuinely alive. It breathed. Its coat darkened when it rained. It knew the terrain and adjusted its gait on slopes. People played it slowly. They did not rush to the next mission. They rode for the sake of riding, watching the sun come up over the mountains, listening to the sound of the hooves on different ground. This kind of playing, unhurried, exploratory, almost meditative, had a name that the industry had started to use: wandering. Open-world games were good for wandering. Some players spent hours simply moving through the world, not achieving anything in particular, finding pleasure in the movement itself. Into this world came something small and unexpected. In 2007, Apple introduced the iPhone, and within a few years the phone in everyone's pocket had become, without anyone quite planning it, one of the most used gaming platforms in the world. The games that thrived on it were simple, mostly. Angry Birds, which arrived in 2009, was about birds launched from a slingshot at structures containing pigs. The physics were satisfying, the levels were short. You could play 1 in 2 minutes on a train and feel at the end of it that something had been accomplished. Candy Crush arrived a few years later, and then a cascade of others, match 3 games and bubble shooters and puzzles of every conceivable kind. They were free to download. They made their money in other ways, in optional purchases, in the small and frequent decisions about whether to spend a currency that was sometimes real money and sometimes not. These games reached billions of people. Many of those people would not have described themselves as gamers. They were people who played games on their phone while waiting for something, or in the small spaces between things, or in the evening when they did not have the energy for anything more demanding. They played without self-consciousness, without the weight of identity that had sometimes made games feel like they were for a specific kind of person. Games had always been for everyone, in the sense that play is for everyone. The phone made that obvious in a way it had not always been. Something else was happening at the same time, quieter and less visible. Small teams of developers, sometimes teams of 1 or 2 or 3 people, were making games on their own, without the backing of the large studios, without millions of dollars, and releasing them to anyone who wanted to play them. This had always been technically possible, but the internet had made it practical in a new way. You could release a game online and people anywhere in the world could find it, and play it, and tell other people about it. Minecraft arrived in 2009, built almost entirely by a single Swedish programmer named Marcus Persson, released first in an unfinished state to a small community of players who paid a small fee and gave feedback and watched it grow. The game was about blocks. Everything in it was made of cubes. Trees were cubes, mountains were cubes, water was cubes, your hands were cubes. You could break the cubes apart and reassemble them into other shapes. You could build houses and castles and replicas of real-world buildings and elaborate machines and whatever else you could imagine, given that it needed to be made out of cubes. It was not graphically impressive. It was not narratively complex. It was the kind of game that, described to someone who had not played it, sounded extremely dull, and then they would sit down with it, and several hours would pass without their noticing, and they would have built something that they were surprised to find they were proud of. There was a cave in Minecraft that was dark, and in the dark things lived that would try to harm you, and so you needed light, and to get light you needed to mine for coal, and to mine for coal you needed a pickaxe, and to make a pickaxe you needed wood, and to get wood you needed to find a tree. And so the first thing you did in a new game was look around the world, which was generated fresh for each player, different every time. Acres and acres of landscape procedurally conjured from rules and random numbers, and find a tree, and punch it with your bare hands until pieces of wood fell out, and pick up the wood, and begin. The beginning was always the same. The world was always different. And in that combination, something that felt like genuine adventure was possible every single time. Minecraft became, by some measures, the best-selling game of all time. It was played by children who built elaborate structures with friends, and by adults who played alone at night, constructing things in silence. It was used in schools to teach architecture and city planning and mathematics. It was used by researchers to model the spread of information through social networks. It was used by people who were simply lonely to have somewhere comfortable to be. Around Minecraft and around other indie games of that period, there grew a culture of watching. People recorded themselves playing and posted the recordings to a website called YouTube, and other people watched. This sounds like a strange way to spend an evening, watching someone else play a game, and yet the numbers were extraordinary. Hundreds of millions of views on single videos, communities built around particular players, particular games, particular ways of engaging with those games. What people were watching was not always the game itself. They were watching a person, a personality, the particular way someone reacted to being startled, or succeeded at something difficult, or narrated their own confusion aloud in a way that was somehow both funny and familiar. The games were the occasion. The person was the reason. The years moved on, and the games moved with them, and by the mid-2000s something had crystallized that had been developing for a long time. Games were being taken seriously in ways they had not always been. The Museum of Modern Art in New York added games to its permanent collection. Pac-Man, Tetris, Minecraft and others, presented as works of design worthy of preservation and study. Academic programs devoted to game design had existed for years but were now common. Books were being written about games, not instruction books or strategy guides, but books about what games meant, about their history, about their art. There were players who streamed themselves playing games online, in long unedited sessions that could last 6 or 8 or 10 hours, and millions of people watched these streams. Not because the person streaming was unusually skilled necessarily, but because there was something appealing about the company, about watching someone else encounter a world and react to it, share their reactions, be surprised and pleased and occasionally frustrated. It was a kind of togetherness built from a considerable distance. Dark Souls, a game series from a Japanese studio, became famous for its difficulty, and became famous equally for the culture of help and sharing that grew up around it. The games were hard enough that most players would fail repeatedly, and rather than keeping their discoveries secret, players shared them lavishly, in forum posts and video essays and message board threads that could run to hundreds of pages. They left messages for each other inside the game itself, using a limited vocabulary of words and phrases to warn and advise and occasionally joke. Try jumping, someone might write, leaving it beside a bottomless pit. Or praise the sun, the motto of a community that had formed around a quest giver who greeted the daylight with outstretched arms. There was a warmth to this, a generosity. The game was very hard, and people found each other in the difficulty and chose to help rather than to hoard. The PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One arrived in 2013, and they were powerful enough that the worlds being built for them could be genuinely vast in a new way. The Witcher 3 was released in 2015, and it contained a world, rolling hills and dark forests and marshes and harbour towns and snowy mountain villages, that took a brisk walker perhaps 100 real hours to cross entirely. The people who populated it had their own stories, their own concerns, their own small histories that extended beyond the boundaries of any quest you might undertake involving them. You could ride past them on horseback without stopping. You could arrive in a village and find that the blacksmith had a dispute with the miller and spend an hour resolving it, or you could never speak to either of them and never know. The weather changed in The Witcher 3. Rain came in over the marshes. Fog sat in the valleys in the morning and burned off by midday. Wind moved through fields of tall grass in waves. These things served no gameplay purpose. Rain did not make the game harder or easier. Fog did not change what was or was not possible. They were there simply because a world without weather would feel less like a world. The designers had understood that inhabiting a space requires more than just moving through it. It requires the space to feel alive around you. There was something overwhelming about games this large, something that could tip in certain moods from wonder into a kind of gentle anxiety. So much to do, so many places to go, so many stories waiting to be picked up and followed. Players talked about feeling at a loss when they had finished such games, a particular kind of mild grief at having exhausted something that had seemed, for a while, inexhaustible. Skyrim, which had come a few years earlier, inspired this feeling especially. A game so large and so thoroughly inhabited, with its mountains and its tundras and its ancient Nordic ruins, that people returned to it for years. Each new return found them in a slightly different mood, playing differently, noticing things they had not noticed before, finding corners of the world they had somehow missed in all their previous visits. There was an inn in Skyrim called the Bannered Mare in the central city of Whiterun, and it was warm inside. Firelight and the smell of imaginary food and the sound of a bard playing the same few songs over and over in the corner. Players went there not because they needed anything from it, but because it felt like somewhere to be, somewhere quiet, somewhere that was the same every time you came back to it, reliable and lit and smelling of nothing you could actually smell but could somehow almost smell. It became something of a joke. How many times Skyrim had been released, ported to new platforms, made available on new systems, but the joke contained something true, that people kept returning to it, kept wanting to be inside it again, the way you return to a place that has meant something to you. There were quieter games too in these years, games that pushed in a different direction entirely. Journey, released in 2012, was a game about walking through a desert toward a mountain. You were a robed figure of uncertain identity. You walked, and you slid down sand dunes, and you found ancient ruins, and you moved toward the mountain. The game was short, perhaps 2 hours from beginning to end. It had no words, no explanation, no instructions beyond what you gradually discovered by doing. The desert in Journey was beautiful in the way that real deserts are beautiful, vast and dry and silent, with the wind moving across the sand in patterns that shifted as you watched. The ruins were large and strange, remnants of a civilization that the game never explained. You did not need to understand them. You moved through them the way you move through something old that you have stumbled upon unexpectedly, with curiosity and a kind of respect. If another player was playing at the same time, they might appear near you, another robed figure in the desert. You could not speak to them. You could only make a chiming sound by pressing a button, the same sound for everyone, with different lengths depending on how long you held the button. You could walk near each other. You could wait for each other. You could experience the world together in silence. Players wrote at length about what it felt like to encounter another figure in the desert, about the unspoken agreements that formed, to stay together, to show each other things, to wait at the top of a rise until the other had climbed it too. The game became famous partly for this, for what happened between players who had been given almost no tools to communicate, and who found ways to communicate anyway. What do you do when you cannot speak and you want to say, "I am here, I see you, shall we go together?" You walk a little closer, and you wait, and you see what happens. There is a moment near the end of Journey, just before the final ascent of the mountain, where the environment becomes very cold and very difficult, and the robed figure moves slowly and with difficulty through snow and ice. Players report that this section is hard in a way that is different from the usual game hard. Hard in a way that feels physical, even though nothing physical is happening. And if another player is with you, you instinctively move closer to them. You do not know why. Nothing in the game tells you to, but you do it. Afterward, at the end, the game shows you the name of the other player. Not a username or a gamer tag. Their real given name, quietly displayed on the screen before the credits roll. It is a small and gentle gesture. After all that silence, a name. Virtual reality had been promised and attempted and failed many times before it arrived in a form people could actually use in 2016. The headsets were heavy and required significant machinery to run. They were expensive. Putting one on required adjustment, the gentle fog of your vision that takes a moment to clear, the slight disorientation of finding yourself somewhere other than your living room. But once it cleared, the experience of being inside a virtual space was different from anything that had come before. Not better necessarily, not the future exactly, but different in a way that resisted description. You were not watching a screen, you were inside the screen. The geometry of the world surrounded you. You could reach out and not quite touch things, but gesture toward them in a way that felt like something. People stood in virtual galleries and looked at paintings hanging on virtual walls and felt that they were in a gallery. They stood on virtual mountain peaks and felt the vertigo of height, even though they were standing in their living rooms. They sat in virtual cinemas and watched films, the screen large above them, other virtual audience members sitting in the seats around them. It was a technology still finding itself, waiting for the artists and the designers and the storytellers who would understand what to do with it, who would make something in it that could only exist in it, that could not be translated back to a flat screen without losing something essential. Those works were beginning to appear, cautiously and slowly at the edges of the medium, and now we arrive somewhere close to the present, where the story is harder to see clearly because we are still inside it. Games are everywhere, on phones and on televisions and on computers and on small handheld devices and on systems connected to the internet that allow the most demanding games to run on almost any screen, anywhere. There are games played by billions of people and games played by dozens of people. There are games that are competitive and games that are cooperative and games that are simply private, played alone in the evenings by people who might not mention to many others that they play at all. There is still a kind of shyness in some quarters about admitting to games as a meaningful part of life, a sense that they are a lesser thing, a guilty thing, something to grow out of. This is changing slowly as the people who grew up with games become adults and take that history with them. But it has not entirely changed yet. The people who make games, the best of them, are thinking about the same things that the best makers of any art form think about. How do you make something true? How do you make someone feel something real? How do you build a space, physical or emotional, that a person can move through and come out of changed in some small way, carrying something with them they did not have before? These are old questions. They are as old as the first stories told around the first fires. The technology changes. The questions stay the same. A game called Celeste, released in 2018, was made by a small team over a period of about 2 years, and it was about a young woman climbing a mountain. On the surface, it was a precise and demanding platforming game. You jumped and climbed and dashed through levels that required exact timing. Beneath the surface, it was about anxiety and self-doubt, and the particular difficulty of continuing when everything in you is saying that you cannot or should not or do not deserve to. The mountain in Celeste was a metaphor that the game wore lightly. It did not insist on itself. You could play it as simply a game about climbing if you wanted, but if you were in a particular kind of mood or a particular kind of life, the mountain was something else. The hard thing you were trying to do, whatever that was for you, and the question of whether you were capable of doing it. Players wrote about it at length. People who struggled with anxiety recognized something. People who had gone through difficult periods and come out the other side recognized something. The game had found a way to talk about something real without stating it directly. It had encoded the feeling into the mechanics, into the way the character moved, into the way the mountain resisted her, into the way she fell and got up and tried again. This is what the best games can do, and it is not so different from what the best books can do, or the best films, or the best songs. They find the shape of something true. They give you somewhere to put feelings you did not know how to hold. A game called What Remains of Edith Finch, released in 2017, let you walk through a house and learn the stories of the people who had lived there. Each story told in a different way, each one a small formal experiment in what games could do with narrative. One story was told through the labels on cans in a cannery. One was told through the pages of a comic book that filled the screen as you moved through it. One was told from the point of view of a child in a bathtub, and it was gentle and sad and strange, and players who finished it often sat quietly for a moment before doing anything else. The house in the game was an old American farmhouse, tall and eccentric, with rooms added at odd angles and a crow's nest at the top. Walking through it had the quality of walking through someone else's memory, not quite understanding everything you saw but feeling the weight of it. The particular weight of a house that has held many people and now holds only their things. And so we come to rest finally in the simplest image. A person in a room, late at night. The screen in front of them, casting its soft light. Their hands on a controller, or a keyboard, or a phone. Some object that translates the small movements of their fingers into something that happens on the screen, that happens in a world that does not exist anywhere except in that relationship between them and the machine. They are concentrating, or perhaps they are not concentrating. Perhaps they are in that state beyond concentration, where the thing you are doing and the thing you are no longer feel separate, where the character on the screen is, in some complicated sense, you, moving through a world that you've come to know in a way that is not so different from the way you know the rooms of your own house. Outside the window, the neighbourhood is dark and quiet. Someone is walking a dog at the far end of the street, their footsteps faint. A cat is sitting on a fence somewhere, watching something in the grass. The houses are mostly dark, their inhabitants asleep or nearly so. But in this room, there is a small and private world going on. A character is moving through a landscape that exists nowhere but here, in this light, in this quiet. And the person playing is somewhere between this room and that one, present in both, belonging fully to neither, in that particular in-between state that games create, and that, after all this time, still has no entirely satisfactory name. It is a new thing, this way of spending an evening. It did not exist 100 years ago. 50 years ago it existed only in laboratories, as a curiosity. And yet the impulse behind it, to play, to enter a story, to move through a world that is not this one and see what it contains, is as old as anything about us. It is in the children drawing pictures in cave walls. It is in the Sumerians playing board games. It is in the chess players at the window of the cafe, the warm afternoon light falling on the board, the pieces heavy in the hand. We have always wanted to be somewhere else, in imagination for a while. We have always wanted to see what happens when we do one thing and then another. We have always wanted a world that responds to us. The screen gives us that, the particular glow of it, late at night, in a room where everything else is quiet. It is not such a strange thing in the end. It is in fact a very old thing in a very new container, and you can close your eyes now. The game will still be there in the morning,